You're listening to Adapt or Die, the podcast that explores the science of transformation and the many forces that are driving businesses to think differently about their enterprise and ultimately make smarter, faster, data-driven decisions. And in this episode, we're going to focus on the idea of demand, specifically how demand and demand signals might influence the design of the supply chain. And to cover this topic, I've got two experts with me on the show today. They are Ryan Chan and Vikram Srinivasan. Gentlemen, good to have you both here. Let's kick this off with just quick introductions. Vic, we've had you on the show, but Ryan, you're new here. Let us know a little bit about what you do.
So, I'm Ryan Chan. I'm part of the solution design team with LLamasoft. And my primary responsibility is to educate our customers and prospects on what our technologies are capable of, and making sure that they have their questions answered, and to make sure that they understand the value that our technology can bring to their business in addressing any opportunities that they have.
Excellent. And Vic, I'm sure you need no introduction, but just quickly.
Yeah, I'm part of the product management team. I lead the product strategy and demand forecasting, and our products are on the digital twin as well, so we'll talk more about that. Looking forward to our discussion today, Matt.
So today we're going to talk about a concept and just get some perspective around case studies and how this can manifest itself around this idea of demand-driven design. Ryan, what is that?
So obviously LLamasoft has been focused on the concept of supply chain design or decision making for a long time, since the beginning of our company. And what we've seen in the market is that as companies get into building up capabilities to do design and use quantitative methods to solve the problem, they spend a lot of time dialing in what we call the baseline, which is a reflection of our current state. And that means, validating the cost and the capacities and the current demand and so forth. But decisions are generally made in the future, because what they would like to do is to understand strategically where they should be going in the next, few months, few years, and so forth. And in the past, there weren't really a lot of great tools to help companies understand where they're going from a demand perspective. And one of the practices that a lot of practitioners will recognize is that they grow the demand itself by, let's say, a fixed number like 3%, or they'll take the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and index the demand to it, but not really capturing the nuances of, well, how has consumer behavior shifted? How has population or demographics shifted? How am I doing against my competitors? Things like cannibalization, new product introduction. A lot of those things are not taken into account. So then what ends up happening is they have a very accurate baseline to reflect their current business, but as they model out a few months, a few years, and so forth, they tend to make some mistakes in terms of what the new strategy should be. So, people are confused. Well, I have a really, really solid baseline, but why am I missing out on the optimal answer? And the implications of that is pretty big. So, Vic and I kind of talked about a couple of, cases that we've seen with our customers where, for example, a furniture maker, it's trying to figure out where they should put their next production facility based on, where the customer demand exists.
So in this case, we're looking at it purely from a network design example, right?
Yes, exactly. So this is a network strategy of, where should I place, these very, very expensive assets. And furniture is a very expensive product to transport because of the bulk and the weight and so forth. And so you don't want to make a mistake there, right? What this company found was if they were using the traditional approach to doing network design, and they use some kind of simple method for growing the demand, when they run the model, it will essentially locate their production facility in the southern part of the country. Now, they went back and did some sensitivities, took a look at, hey, what if we actually use a product that can, get us a set of future demand that's much more reliable based on, external causal factors, based on very solid quantitative methods to understand what that demand should look like. And when they put that in and recreated the model, now the model is saying, well, it actually should be in the Northeast because that's where a lot of that demand is growing. And so imagine if they made the mistake of putting a facility down south, and now they have to transport a large quantity of their products thousands of miles to New York or to the Northeast. It fundamentally makes them less competitive.
Right, or they have to make that investment further down the road and build the other facility in the Northeast. So it's a little bit closer would be another option, and neither of those seem like you're getting out of it without someone losing their job or getting in a lot of trouble. I mean, when you make a mistake on a decision that big, thousands of miles and millions of dollars in transportation, but you wouldn't necessarily have seen that while looking at past data, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So if I was just looking at what I've done in the last, 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, that may not be an indicator of where my future business is going to grow, and that's in such a capital intensive and competitive market, that's not really a mistake you want to make. So. And a lot of what we've seen is that companies focus on planning solutions and things like that, and they do it really well. But if the fundamental supply chain infrastructure is wrong, it doesn't really matter how well you plan. You're just not going to be competitive against somebody who has thought about these things and is much better aligned with the actual demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of a sudden you're seeing the future in a way, right? What's the science behind that, Vic?
So, like Ryan said, I think the key is the word design. When you're saying design, you're trying to fundamentally make some changes to your supply chain. And if you're making the changes to supply chain, you're not making it for today or yesterday. You're making it for tomorrow and the next 3 years, the next 5 years. And it's very important to have a good snapshot of what that's going to be before you make the changes. And typically we're talking about infrastructure changes. We're talking about policy changes. We're talking about, shifting, maybe different markets. And a supply chain, as agile as we want it to be, is a physical entity. And so when you make these $1 million decisions, you have to be very precise on the future of what you're looking at and be able to model that. And so I think from that standpoint, if you can take that outside-in approach and start with where's the market going? Where are my customers going? What are the product interactions looking like? Are there other competitive pressures that are going to change that? Because, 3 years ago, how we shopped is completely different than how we're shopping now. We've got to anticipate those, and we're not going to be rocket scientists to figure that out automatically. We're going to have to use some data-backed science and figure that out. So once you get that part of it right, now the implications on the design aspect is also very important. So tying the future demand to the supply chain is very critical, and we're seeing customers seamlessly do that.
Does this only manifest itself in the physical footprint of your supply chain network? Like were we talking about facility placement or where that next factory is going to be or which one's going to close? Or does this concept bleed into other practices across supply chain? Does it impact logistics?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So infrastructure planning is one aspect of it. Aggregate planning is one. Strategic decision making. Finance teams are looking at it in terms of what the design needs to be. But design is not just infrastructure changes. A design can be as simple as understanding, how you have a different stocking strategy and inventory. Or to your point on logistics, understanding the way you're going to do inbound consolidation. And then the last mile delivery also depends on a lot of the future-looking demand that comes in. So it's not always a big change that needs to happen. It could be a strategic change. It could be tactical. And that's why we call it design and decision-making. Because decision-making can be in different horizons. And we're seeing that horizon actually blur.
Right. When you talk about decisions, I mean, you're also talking about a lot of different possibilities, all leading to a different outcome. Some of them can cost you a lot of money, it seems.
Well, I talked about planning earlier, and all planning systems rely on a set of business rules, right? So we call those policies. One of the interesting examples that Vic is very familiar with is a company that does a lot of B2B types of business, and they didn't necessarily go change their network, but they took into account the shifts in demand, and they went back and looked at what policies should I have, what are those business rules, and how should they adapt to how the demand patterns have changed within my network. And obviously, some of that stuff you don't need to make billion-dollar capital investments to do, and it might be as simple as going into some of the planning systems and and dialing up or down some of the control levels of inventories and things like that. And that has a huge amount of impact.
That's really interesting, Ryan. So, Vic, if demand is such a big influencer and driver here, then why aren't people necessarily using it today?
Yeah, very good question. And it's kind of, it's goes back to what people get used to doing, right? You traditionally look at your capacities, you look at your flows, you look at your inventory, and you think your supply chain is that, and that's what you need to optimize. But the drivers around that, you're doing all that to meet demand. But you forget about that because you're in the weeds of making those planning decisions, and there's not a lot of time to take a step back. We have the luxury to do that and understand the underlying problem for our customers, right? So we've noticed that our customers need a better looking forward signal. And what I understood from the market is that the gap in the marketplace is around looking at that demand history. And the problem for supply chain decisions is when you look at only your demand history and that's your single source of truth, the further away you go into the future, you're going further away from that single source of truth that you're basing your forecast off of. So in the end, they're not able to use that information in the design process, which are more mid to long-term decisions. But if you can bring those causal variables or the external drivers along with your demand signal to the future, then you're well informed with an outside-in approach of what that demand looks like, which then allows you to make those supply chain decisions that are more forward-looking. And that's been the fundamental gap is a lot of the forecasting capabilities have always focused on solving the planning and tactical horizon problems on short term, what I mean by 3 to 6 months. And those are great and phenomenal at that. But there's a big market gap that we've identified and our customers need. And now we're starting to see customers adopt that capability and make better informed decisions, where I'm talking about customers who have already seen about $300 million in working capital reductions potentially in their network by just understanding a better forward-looking projection of their demand.
And then what about customers, that make product decisions, right? In terms of how much of a product to make or to even introduce a certain product because they understand the demand a little bit better or the drivers behind that demand. So if I'm, making engines and I want to understand, what's driving a particular type of diesel engine I'm producing, I could look at the past demand and say, well, it kind of grows at 2% a year, so I'm just going to make that. But then if I know that this particular type of engine is driven by mining versus another type is driven by construction, then, if I have that information from an external, source, and I know the correlation or the relationship between that external source data versus my own demand, that can help me make these very, very expensive decisions around what to invest in and how much to invest.
We'll walk through another example of this playing itself out, but a couple of things I just want to circle back on the conversation so far. You're looking at external forces on your demand, different variables out there. You're looking at going beyond the systems that you own today. You talk about outside-in approach. All of this points to this idea that by validating with things that are beyond your control or your direct purview, you're helping to eliminate bias within the supply chain.
You do, but the other part too is that it's not only the external stuff, right? Because a lot of decisions that businesses make on their own can influence demand. For example, announcing a price change on a product, or running promotions, or introducing a new product that complements or maybe even competes with an existing product. These things all have an impact on the demand that already exists. And so the question is, how do you measure and how do you make use of that information to inform you of how that demand reacts based on the forces that are introduced on it, whether it's internal stuff or external?
So, okay, let's start to close this episode out, but we've looked at a lot of really amazing things. But why not give us one more example of how this demand-driven approach has helped influence a major organization?
Yeah, and it also goes back to your question earlier, Matt, that do you have to always be making infrastructural changes, or could you impact decisions that are less, disruptive to a change in your supply chain physically, right? And what comes to mind is, one of our customers in the military sector, they have some really important challenges around shipping and deploying some of their materials across their troops in different parts of the countries, right? And we're talking about shipping from the U.S. to EMEA regions. We're talking about shipping from U.S. to Middle East. And in the past, they would use commercial flights, and they would just make a call 3 days before, and they would get a flight to go and charter that from the U.S. all the way to the Middle East, and it was pretty cheap and easy. With e-commerce coming in and disruption from that part of it, it's much more difficult. You've got to book all this a year ahead. So the interesting paradigm here is you're trying to make a decision based on a bet you want to make 1 year in advance, which means you need to be accurate in understanding what that demand is. And so they were using simple techniques to come up with that, again, based on what they did in the past. And as soon as they bought their own internal factors, not even going out to our trend cloud and bringing external data, they found that the model was telling them that a factor in the EMEA region actually impacted their shipping between the US and the Middle East. And so the company was like, that doesn't make any sense. Why should EMEA have any impact when I ship goods from the US to the Middle East? And they dug into the causal factor. They found some strong correlations. And in the past, up until 2013, they actually did that. And they forgot about it because it's so back in the past. And when they included those causals, that helped explain some of the variations. It helped inform them of how they should forecast in the future. And the accuracy, we're talking about 10, 12 points of improvements in order to, forecast 1 year in advance for a very important problem. Because this problem, if you get it wrong, not only impacts your supply chain efficiencies and costs, but also impacts lives. You're talking about folks deployed in different parts of the country that need the product at the right time.
So put it in another way, so for years they've been including this one-time change in volume, and they've been over-forecasting over and over again. And so by including it as a causal and the system recognizing it as a one-time change, that realigned the actual volume, and it allowed them to buy their capacity with a lot more accuracy.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing because, to your point, I kind of laugh at thinking about air freight as cheap, but when all of a sudden Amazon and Walmart are your competition, and they not only have tons of money at their disposal, but massive scale, yeah, you really do have to be able to think ahead and carve out that capacity as early as possible, or else you're going to...
And accurately.
Yeah, and accurately. And I was going to say, or else you're going to miss the boat, but we're talking about planes. Don't miss one of those either. All right, gentlemen, any concluding thoughts as we wrap up this episode? I think we probably have some more that we can dive into from this point on the next one.
I would just say that, this, from a design perspective, this has completely changed the game. Having an accurate future projection of where your demand, not just quantity, but what are you selling, where is it selling, or where is it moving to, change the answers fundamentally on the design side for the better. And, anyone that's doing any kind of supply chain decision making should really take a hard look at how the academic side and technology side has progressed and how to take advantage of the tools now that are available to them. Because if you're a company that's doing design, it's no longer an only differentiation. A lot of people are doing that, but having a more accurate set of data coming in to do design against, that's the new competition that's being formed on the market.
Yeah, and to that point, I just like to have a few closing comments here. Making decisions for the future, you're never going to predict a number, a forecast. And I'd like to come back to that theme that I've talked earlier about is don't focus on the number. It's not I need to account for 500 units 3 years from now. If I were to say that, I'm kidding you guys, right? It's about the drivers. It's about getting down to the next level of detail, because then you can do scenario planning, you can do contingency planning, because we're living in a very competitive market space, and those are going to change. If change is always going to happen, your biggest tool is scenario modeling. And if you can model your different scenarios in a design environment and account for the pessimistic, optimistic, and realistic scenarios, then you're in a much better chance of making investments and thinking through the decisions. So that's a very important aspect of understanding demand and the drivers versus just jumping to a number and saying, here's my number, because that's going to change. And the last part I'll also say is when you're designing a supply chain, in the past, it's all about finding the cost reductions, right? It's always been about that. And we've seen customers do it and we continue seeing them do it. But now we're shifting gears to gaining market share, profitability. So demand is an important aspect there, because not only do you want to forecast it for cost efficiency gains, you want to predict where the markets are going and the trends in the market and your brands and your categories. and invest in the right ones so that when you make the design decisions, it's for the next 3 years where you're part of the growth of the market and not left behind. So I think that's a very important aspect, is follow the demand, start with the customer, start with the market, and then drive the decisions, both from a cost efficiency perspective and market share perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, the supply chain used to be the best way to spend a lot of money. Now it's becoming the most strategic way to make money.
Yep.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Adapt or Die. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast network. To learn more about the show, please visit LLamasoft.com/podcast. And if you're finding us on the networks, hit the subscribe button and leave us a review, and you'll be doing us a big favor. My name is Matt Gunn. Thanks again for listening.